My name is Crystal Phillips, and welcome everybody. I'm excited to be the host of today's Expert Corner. First, I'm just going to do a little introduction if you don't know about BioHub. It is an incredible opportunity for Alberta. It's a nonprofit life sciences hub. It offers turnkey labs, expert programs, and a network of mentors that help health tech and biotech ventures move from benchside all the way to market faster and without risk. I was a part of BioHub at the early days, and when we threw the idea out there, we thought, let's budget for filling the space within about 3 years. And I think we filled it in about 3 months. And there was a waiting list for more and more people and companies wanting to have access to this space because of how important it is and how the life sciences sector is particularly growing in Alberta and Calgary. So a little bit about me. I love health. My background is I started a neuroscience charity called the Branch Out Neurological Foundation. We turned 15 years this year. And when I'm not volunteering as chair of the board for the Branch Out Foundation, I am wearing my new hat. Literally, as of yesterday, was my first day as the senior director of OSIF, which is the Opportunity Calgary Investment Fund. And we invest in projects and programs that help with the Calgary economy. So I'm excited to host the webinar today. We've got amazing experts. Hopefully this is the most you'll have to hear from me because we've got some really exciting topics to cover. We're going to explore the overlap between clinical data, real world evidence, regulatory pathways and market access and reimbursement strategies. So hopefully we are efficient in covering all of those amazing topics in about 45 minutes because I do want to leave some room for questions with the audience. However, if you do have questions along the way, feel free to put it in the chat and I might just ask them throughout. So to start, I'm going to have our 3 amazing panelists introduce themselves. Tara, why don't we start with you?
Yes, thank you so much, Crystal, and thanks BioX Hub for hosting this event and inviting me to join. So my name is Tara Cowling. I'm the founder of Medlior Health Outcomes Research. We're headquartered in Calgary and coming up to 17 years old. So I like to joke we're nerds for hire. We do evidence generation to support essentially market access for life sciences companies. Our specialty is in the real world evidence domain. My background is actually I worked in the data department of Alberta Health Services for 5 years. So I have an understanding of the health data infrastructure and access to that data to support industry sponsored studies, particularly to help, as I say, with that sort of pathway to access and adoption. So really happy to be here today. Thank you so much.
Love nerds for hire. That's a great line.
I'm going to steal that.
Yeah. How about you, Stefan?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot as well for joining. I think the big discussion today, I think it's a quite interesting one. I mean, where I'm coming from, I'm an economist from background. I founded the company Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy, which has everything basically in its name. Not that long ago than Tara, but it was also founded in 2012. So already as well, quite a bit of experience just with the company itself. But myself personally, I was always working in that area, market access, reimbursement, pricing. And within that, not so much, of course, because I'm from Germany, on the Canadian side, but rather on the international side. Meaning, I have touched base quite a lot of projects, especially from a market access funding side within the US, but of course as well from Europe. And with BioX, I think where we basically crossed each other was with the first project, also with a company here out of Calgary, where we had the first kind of touch points. And then thereafter, while we have also invented a couple of artificial intelligence tools and platforms to be used in market access, we have basically came back to BioHub X, or they basically as well approached us. And we're also part of some of their really smart packages for the startups here in the area.
Oh, love that, Stefan. And it's nice to have a global mind to the panel today. How about you, Karen?
Hi, I'm Karen Matthews, and I'm a quality and regulatory affairs consultant. So I love your nerd for hire. I'm also a nerd for hire. And it's really my aim to help startups meet all of the regulatory requirements that they need to be successful. And again, it varies from industry to industry. So I've probably been working in diagnostic labs longer than some of you have been alive. And my background is quality safety, working for large diagnostic lab organizations, and I've been consulting for about the last decade.
I love that. Having worked with many healthcare startups, one, they start thinking about the regulatory pathways too late. And then two, when they start thinking about it, it's like a total panic to try and find the talent and expertise. So great to have you on the panel, and hopefully a lot of people can benefit from this talk today. So I'm going to go back to you, Tara, hoping that you can define further your areas of expertise and your interactions with health tech or life sciences companies aiming to get to market.
Yeah, for sure. So, really when it comes to sort of evidence generation, you want to be thinking about it earlier rather than later. So oftentimes, especially with startups, you want to be thinking about what is the landscape? How does your product fit into what is currently available for patients in that therapeutic area? Because one of the things that we see is often a thinking around, we're building a product and it works and it's super exciting because the science works and the innovation is there. The key question is, but is anyone going to buy it, right? Adoption, you have to think about the end and work backwards to make sure that you build an evidence strategy to facilitate your ability to come to market. And so understanding things like what is the current standard of care, what outcomes or results of utilizing your product actually matter to the people that are going to be paying for it. So is it a health system payer? Is it patients? And what data can you collect and generate to show that you are actually solving the problem that matters to the people that are going to use it and are going to pay for it? So the science itself isn't enough. You need to take that bigger picture of thinking about how do you actually get your technology into the hands of the people that are going to be using it, that you're really making that difference for. So some of that evidence generation can be started much earlier in the process. So as I say, sort of get that landscape assessment, really help start building your value proposition. That's actually going to help you from an investor standpoint anyway. So even though you may be years off from going to Health Canada or having conversations with payers, starting to set up that evidence strategy and understanding that market can be really beneficial. So there's different ways to generate real world evidence. Real world evidence just means patient level data. So typically, whatever format you're going to collect it in, it's a variety of different study designs. You usually need ethics approval because you're going to actually be speaking or contacting patient data sort of directly. So it can be a little bit quicker through a patient survey. So you can reach out to patients, interviews, focus groups, online surveys, gather some information to understand where is the unmet need for this therapeutic area? And physicians, obviously, that approach can be done too, to really start to frame that out. More robust types of evidence you can utilize is the actual health system data as well. So we help companies access the data here in Alberta to really understand how many patients actually have this condition. So if you have, for example, a device in Parkinson's disease, you're going to want to know, what does the Parkinson's market look like? You can extrapolate what you see in Alberta to other provinces, to other countries. So there is a way of taking that data and generalizing it to a broader, more global context, but it's going to help you understand who are the patients, what do they look like, how are they currently being treated, because it could actually inform you with, where that unmet need lies, help robustly quantify that so that you can better message then to either those payers or the patients or the providers to say, we're going to make the most impact in patients that look like this. Then you can get into the market and think about expanding beyond that. But if you can really hone in on that value proposition and quantify that through that unmet need, it's not just, I think this is going to make a difference. You can actually show and demonstrate that it's going to make a difference and that it is solving a problem that does need to be solved. So that's a little bit about our work. We kind of work on the strategic side. Well, what evidence do you need to gather? Helping gather that evidence, and then the messaging of that evidence to support you throughout that entire process, as I say, from even the investor stage, and it's still early stage, but then utilizing that evidence for your regulatory and reimbursement pathways too.
Thank you, Tara. And you touched on this. You're making, as an investor, you make our job easier if founders of companies are already seeing that pathway and communicate it in a story, like how you're talking about, it makes it much easier for us to understand. There's a famous quote by Jim Gibson, one of the co-founders of Thin Air Labs. He always said, it's not about just the innovation of the thing. It's also, and even more often more important, about the innovation of the way. So it's not what you're doing, but how you're getting that into market. So this is you did a great job of explaining what all it takes. And I'm probably going to hear this often, but the earlier, the better. Start thinking about it now, map out, the 5 to 10 years, even your exit strategy, and work backwards. Now, I also understand that this can be intimidating because it's like, whoa, where do I even start? So I'll hopefully we'll be able to answer some of those questions as we go. But I wanted to move on to my next question, which is for Stefan. Now, your expertise can help young companies save a lot of time and money while getting to revenue sooner. That is all a very attractive sounding line. Can you expand on this?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's basically on top what Tara already said, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I think especially towards the end, I think Tara, what you said, I think trying to find out where the unmet need is, right? And I think this is as well, or should as well be a key driver, for example, to put your evidence generation together. I think that's the first thing, right? And a lot of companies, not only startups, basically first start with the science, then go into the kind of evidence generation, so just running the first studies, and then just thereafter, when they have seen, when they've basically found out the kind of key parameters, the outcomes basically for the patient, then they start thinking about regulatory is one thing, but especially then also around maybe pricing and reimbursement. I think having said that, I mean, especially we all know that, let's say, money is normally a bit, let's say, short-sighted, especially also with startups and especially in the early kind of days. So they need as well to be efficient, meaning we need to find nowadays as well solutions which could be adopted easily, and of course as well to a, let's say, minimized kind of budget. That is also where we have tried to now develop different platforms basically in order to streamline the information a bit further, which is not only, of course, for one country, because I think one of the key questions from my perspective, at least when I would be, or when I'm discussing with investors, also the scaling up, right? So if there's an idea, if there's a medtech idea, or even a pharma kind of product ingredient, which might be quite nice and helpful, and maybe even adapted in one either province or maybe even across Canada, just as an example over here, that's just one part of it, right? Ultimately, you want to, let's say, also commercialize it even further, which is at least across North America, ideally then also international, meaning either go in Asia and or then as well into Europe. That is why, of course, I think what Tara said is absolutely correct. You need to understand where and how the let's say different pathways are. That's also one of the key packages, which is, for example, in one of our AIs. Try to understand at least early on, at least top level, which kind of pathways, reimbursement pathways, funding pathways are available, and what is also required there. Requirement means, especially at this point in time, which kind of data / evidence you would basically need to have once you are on the market. On the market, when you speak with startups, might as well be a bit of a leeway in a way, right? I mean, it might take them still quite a long time. It's maybe not what they have in mind. And maybe some of those might even have an exit rather in mind. Maybe even others, of course, think about just the next investors round, which would also help. And that's, again, I'm just basically just repeating what Tara as well said, right? I mean, if you bring up a nice story, a nice package, and if you know basically how that product could really, let's say, look like and also get on the market efficiently, the better and the higher value you could, of course, as well ask for the company or the product itself. So reimbursement pathway is one thing. The key and important information as well, I mean, Crystal, you as an investor will probably as well easily agree. I think the key part is also the revenue equation, which is a very simple thing. It's price times volume, right? And both are, let's say, impacted by payer decisions. Meaning you should as well know the kind of volume, which again goes back a bit to real world evidence, what Tara said. But on top as well, you should as well have at least a quick kind of information on the epidemiology, meaning number of patients, maybe in one country, but for sure even better across maybe different countries and jurisdictions. That's also easily available now within AI, probably at your fingertips, right? And then moving a bit alongside, that's also two other key important parts in there, is having at least a first kind of payer perception. What do payers currently think about my idea, at least, or the evidence generation? It does not need necessarily to be like a lot of details, meaning it's more like, do I run a randomized clinical trial? Do I have patient-relevant outcome parameters in there? Do I have a kind of good understanding of my safety parameters? And that's more a kind of rule of thumb. There are also published, let's say, models out there. That's also one of those what we have, for example, integrated in our tools, that you get just a score, a very simple score, that you at least know where you are, and you could also easily explain that to investors. So at this point in time, you would not need to be an expert, I guess, for reimbursement and funding. And the last part, which is, I think, equally important, or maybe even more important, I would say, is to have a good understanding about the cost and price levels in the different countries, which is linked, of course, to reimbursement. But at the end of the day, it's also understanding where are other products, comparators maybe, price anchors available, and or which kind of codes are, for example, available, outpatient, inpatient, for the disease area you want to get in there. Why is that important? Of course, if the price level is already quite high, it might be maybe a bit easier to either squeeze already in with an existing code, or at least you can even anchor your own price at a higher level. If it's not that way, it might be rather an important consideration then to know, maybe I need to know how to best get into maybe an additional code, a new code. And that's what we have now is available. We're not speaking about Canada and the US, maybe leaving Quebec, etc., maybe aside, because that's as well French. But I mean, otherwise, everything is basically available in English, right? If you move into Asia or Europe, you have a lot of different languages as well available. And again, here AI helps easily. If you have a tool where you can easily get, for example, the codes and the prices in a kind of Google-like search engine in English, then you have those information directly available at your fingertips. And keep in mind, startups as well might change their kind of strategy and their kind of directions over time, meaning if you have that at your fingertips, you could also check it over time. So that's as well a bit the kind of package describing also a bit how it would maybe look like in overarching kind of strategy. And it's very much linked to what we have as well just from Tara.
Yeah. I can imagine that 2 years ago plus, it sounds so intimidating. There's so much data and information to collect and gather and organize. But as you mentioned, AI has changed the game. And so we are now capable of thinking at that level without necessarily adding all of this time and work and money to be able to achieve it. So we better start thinking about it now. Appreciate that. Now, Karen, this is a general understanding of the challenges in getting regulatory approval. Maybe this is for my sake. First, can you describe the difference between quality management systems and regulatory approvals, and then describe the overlap between the two?
Sure. If I could actually comment though on Tara and Stefan's first. I'm taking my own notes because I'm learning as we go as well. I really love the fact that you have to ID your value in the marketplace, and that is absolutely critical, and how you are unique in the marketplace. What are consumers willing to pay for your product or device? And how are you going to position yourself in the marketplace? And when you start looking at what regulatory approval is, you also have to know what your market is in order to determine what regulatory pathways you might want to take. So, for example, I always say 9001, ISO 9001. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's the International Standards Organization. Set the very first, I call it the mother of quality management systems. And from the mother came many small babies, like 17025 for calibration labs. So if that's the type of operation you're running, then that's where you want to go. Or it could be 15189 and you're doing more diagnostic work in a laboratory. You might want to do ISO 13485 for medical devices, because a lab developed test is actually a medical device. So again, it's really about determining what your product is in order to know what direction you want to go. I work with one organization that I call them my golden child, because they have their College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta accreditation, which allows them to do diagnostic testing. They also have their ISO 13485, because that allows them to have their lab developed test as a medical device. They have CLIA and they have COLA, so they can market to the U.S. entities. So again, it's about really determining what your product is and which regulatory body would serve you best.
Are you allowed to say who your golden child is?
I don't know. I would have to ask for permission because I'm all about privacy. So
Okay, good answer. It wasn't a test. Okay, so Stefan, you're based in Germany, but your market access tool is relevant in several countries. Can you describe elements companies need to consider when deciding on the best market to enter? Because we're talking about looking at all of the markets, but is there a starting point?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first and early starting point is probably even what Karen just said, right? You need to know basically which kind of product you have, because that's as well, let's say, a key driver when you go into the market access reimbursement pathways, right? I mean, is it diagnostic? Even if it's a medical device, it's still a bit of a question with which kind of risk class you're in, right? Or is it a digital one? So that's varying quite a bit. And if you are not exactly sure, and with some products, especially on the risk classes, it might maybe take a bit of time until you know that for sure, right? But that's an important consideration. Anyhow, the first question in terms of, let's say, commercialization, I think a lot of times it's rather the number of patients, right? Meaning maybe the US first, especially maybe if you're in Canada. Also in terms of language barriers. The other part is, of course, as well the kind of price level. And nowadays, I mean, independent whether it's a drug or not, it's of course as well the kind of question on your price level. But I think ultimately you could always have a couple of hypotheses where maybe to go first. I think what I said earlier is probably at least as important as your kind of ideas where maybe to move as well first is really, I think nowadays you can get information, let's say, quite rapid and quite fast. I think until, as you said, until maybe 2 years ago, you needed to maybe spend around, what is it, 25,000 euros or dollars for one country just to get the insights, right? So the codes, the epidemiology, the reimbursement pathways, etc., which was or is still a lot of money for especially a startup, right? And then you would just have the information for one country, meaning if you wanted to really have an understanding of maybe 4 or 5 countries, you would really need to invest. And maybe you even then just find out, oops, maybe 2 of those should not be my target. So what do I do then, right? Do I just focus on those other 2 or 3? Or maybe do I maybe spend even more money and try to find out a bit further down the line? I think nowadays, as you said as well, it's much easier because you could at least have already an early understanding where the price levels might be interesting. I think a very good example is always, I think we had once a client who was just starting with the normal, let's say, suspects. I think there was a bit of a push by investors to really launch the product really as soon as possible after the regulatory path was gone. And their idea was, as always, maybe let's go US and then Germany at least, maybe England as well. England was more language thingy. Germany was quite big, and with US, I think, for the kind of usual kind of reasons, right? We have then basically analyzed not only those 3 countries, but also with the eye to basically cross Europe and also added a couple of other countries on top. US, for sure, that was quite clear, but at least they had already a very good understanding which kind of PCT codes, for example, were available and how they could already utilize that maybe in the early days of it. That was quite clear. What was rather a bit of surprise was then really in Europe, where Germany was rather being seen a bit more tricky because of one of the reimbursement pathways, but there was suddenly an interesting path and an interesting opportunity because, again, on an existing code in hospitals in Spain. Spain is, let's say, half of the population in Germany, but it was giving them a quite fast entrance, at least into the system, meaning they have already access to over a population around 40 million to quite a good number of patients as well, right? So that's just one of the examples where I think we are, of course, now moving as well a bit away by just saying, look, we are going the kind of usual pathway. Maybe we're targeting the big countries first, and then we'll see what will happen. I think it could at least now go rather into the direction to really be more efficient, meaning really seeing where are the options, where are the opportunities. First start there. Opportunities could be fast pathways, high prices, many patients, and that could also vary a bit based on the goals you have as a company.
So I have to ask, let's bring this local for a second. Are we talking about choosing different markets and countries based on who we want to sell to first, or is it where we want to establish our company? And when you look at Canada or even Alberta specifically, what comes to mind when it comes to either advantages or disadvantages to do so?
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I'm not expert on Alberta, but I guess you three or
From what
Tara,
you
Karen
Come
can
to
easily add to
Alberta,
that. Yeah,
come to
exactly. Yeah,
Alberta.
exactly. You will, you will answer those. So maybe I just start around that, right? I mean, establishing company is one thing, right? And I mean, also there, I think depends a bit on the country regulations, right? I think in Switzerland, for example, small country, but anyway, they, for example, need and want to have an established company in there. If you move, for example, into a European country, it's enough that you have an established company somewhere in the European Union, right? So that's it's not so much then the question, do I go to Spain where the weather is quite nice, or to Germany or to the Netherlands? It's rather what is maybe best applicable to you from a tax perspective, maybe from a logistics perspective, how to bring the product then as well into the European Union, those kind of things. But I think my perspective, and that's again, I have read the reimbursement hat on, is for me, it's rather the question, could I really establish my product in the best way? And that would mean, for example, where could I really optimize, not maximize necessarily, but optimize my price, and where I could rather out of that optimized price then maximize my revenue stream. And that's of course then as well thinking about those kind of launch sequences. And this is basically what you have asked for, right? Which countries would I prefer first? And which countries might maybe come then a bit later. And that's again rather a bit of a local versus global perspective. Sometimes the local ones, of course, as well have a political dimension, whereas that should not be underestimated. So if you have a company established, maybe take Alberta first, somewhere in Alberta, and you have done all the kind of work, maybe it's still wise, and I put a question mark at the end, to maybe start here before maybe going somewhere else. That's at least what we as well have seen in a couple of other countries. But really a question to maybe Tara and Karen as well.
Oh, yeah, you're doing my job for me.
Sorry.
I like it.
Yeah, and of course, Alberta is my home. I definitely love Alberta. I have worked with large lab companies that worked all across Canada. But the standards and regulations for most of the provinces in Canada, if we're talking about lab developed testing or a medical device as a lab developed test, with the exception of Ontario, most provinces are fairly easy to establish a footprint in. I have been on both sides of the fence. I've been an auditee for many different types of assessments, and I've also been an auditor for the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta. And so I know that Alberta has a friendly climate, if you will, for companies that are just starting to establish themselves.
I think there's a lot to unpack here. So a few kind of things that I think are worth really putting out for the audience. Device or drug, device, invasive, non-invasive. Are you selling directly to consumer or to the health system providers, payers? Your market access pathway and the requirements of what's going to be needed will vary greatly depending on how you answer those questions. So that's something to keep in mind. When you talk about the regulatory side, and that's not my area of expertise as much as Karen, but there's different evidence requirements for regulatory versus reimbursement. So that's also something to keep in mind. They have very different objectives. Good news on the regulatory front. There is now an international alignment of FDA, Health Canada, EMA, which is the European FDA and Health Canada, coming together to try and create a single unified regulatory pathway. So you don't have to apply to each of those organizations. If it's approved by one regulatory body, the others will accept it. So there's some good news on the horizon for that. But when it then comes to your next stage of reimbursement, and then obviously market access, it's going to vary greatly depending on what is your technology. So even what market do you choose to go into is going to vary greatly depending on your technology. So it's just these sort of understandings of you've got to plan that strategy early. I do agree Alberta is a great environment, innovative ecosystem, a lot of support for startups, a lot of investor funding, but that how do you then lead to adoption? So understanding what is the requirements depending on the type of technology you have to actually get that market access. If it is a drug, it is going to have to go through Canada's Drug Agency. And obviously for the European countries, as Stefan said, they all have HTA agencies that have different types of requirements, different types of evidence. The other thing, similar to the regulatory bodies coming together, a lot of unification, strangely, wouldn't expect that in today's news cycle, but it's true. There's a process called JCA in Europe. So it's a joint clinical assessment where for all 27 European countries, you can submit one clinical evidence package. They will all review it. And then if you pass that sort of hoop, you can then go and do your HTA submissions to each of the individual countries. The individuality, and Stefan's really touched on this, a lot of it is coming down to your budget impact. A lot of it is health economic. It's around cost effectiveness. So there's still the evidence component, but very much focused on cost, budget. Are you displacing costs that are already in the health system? Like, how do you justify the value for money that it is for the health system to basically purchase your product? Now, you don't have to go through that if you're not a drug. However, devices, it's the Wild West, Calgary. An absolute mess because it depends, right? Every region is different. Are you going to hospitals? AHS has the benefit of obviously having sort of more centralized procurement. That doesn't necessarily mean it's easy. And we've seen that in Alberta. It is something that has to be addressed. A lot of Alberta innovators have not been able to get into AHS, and they've gone to the US because it was easier to get that adoption through the US hospital system. So this is something Alberta is on the radar. It has to change. It needs to change, but it will vary depending on whether you have a drug, a device, is it a digital app? So just knowing that those pathways look different, the requirements are different depending on what type of product you're innovating. And the earlier you sort of, again, understand what does that look like, use ChatGPT. It's really very publicly available information. It'll be able to kind of help guide you of like, okay, this is my pathway for uptake. Either in Canada or the European countries. One of the things Stefan's been talking about with the codes, I don't know if everyone's sort of picked up on that. What he's talking about is like, how do you, from a health system perspective, pull those numbers that you need? There's a diagnostic code for every therapeutic condition. That's how data is captured in health systems, and that's how we know how many patients have a particular condition. That's going to give you your eligible market opportunity. And then you can sort of dive into that more deeply to understand how are they currently being treated? What is that current standard of care? And then again, building that unmet need and even the pricing kind of side of it to understand, what are they currently paying for? But what is the savings? The other point that I think is really important to stress when you're thinking, regardless of the type of innovation, global issue is health system sustainability, right? We have an aging population, more expensive conditions. Our health systems are at capacity. So it's not just about, I have something that's going to improve patient outcomes, like hopefully it does, and that's the point. But if you have a little cherry on top of, I can actually, through my innovation, alleviate some of the system capacity, does your innovation free up frontline workers like nurses or doctor time or visits? Do you have sort of more of an AI type solution that can also reduce sort of that health system capacity or strain? That's going to be a very compelling argument internationally for all health systems. So think about obviously the patient outcomes. How are you fulfilling that unmet need in your therapeutic area? But don't lose sight of the fact that oftentimes with innovations, how it's delivered, how it's packaged, there's all kinds of other value that you may be able to use to distinguish, the adoption of your product over what is currently being used in the health system. And then my final little point, again, thinking about those international markets and globalization, is also to talk to the trade commissioners in those countries, right? So there are trade commissioners. If you need to be connected with, I need to speak to somebody in this jurisdiction or understand even what my market access pathway is in this jurisdiction, that's a really great tool for Albertan and Canadian companies to be able to leverage those resources to get some jurisdictional connections. Because when it comes to adoption, there, as Stefan said, there are absolutely political and spending and other sort of factors that can weigh into it. So having someone in those markets who can actually advise you on that is really, really useful.
Great advice, Tara. It certainly takes an army, doesn't it?
It does. And it sounds like it's a lot. It's just a matter of it's like if you want to get to this result, which is huge, so it seems overwhelming. It's just 100 steps, right? So just what are the steps? Just follow that path. What do you need to do? One thing leads to the next. I would say what's more important is time. And this goes back to our very first conversation. Give yourself years to get that pathway in place. If you try and go, I've got a clinical trial and it works and I want to be in market in 6 months, very unlikely, depending obviously, maybe if it's direct to consumer. But realistically, if you're having to go through any of these, government agencies, there is a pathway, there is a process, and it takes time. So you really want to plan out or at least understand that strategic pathway. What are the 100 steps you need to take to get to market access? And the earlier you can do that and understand that, it'll just make the whole journey that much more pleasant.
I like that. It's the 100 steps, but not in 6 months. It's,
Exactly.
To think about it realistically and
Exactly.
collect what I call unlike minds. So, find people who are better than you in all of those steps and collect them and work with them. That really is a standout feature to any founders that I've come across too. It's like they know when to play their ego and they also know when to park it and play other people's strengths. Now, I'm speaking of all of these ideas and all of this great advice. I'm craving some examples where you know of maybe a company that's at any point in any one of those 100 steps, they find out something and they decided to pivot for the better or for worse. Can any of you think of an example?
Can I tell you of an organization? And so I think everybody here knows what COVID was. And so when COVID was around, everybody wanted to jump on the bandwagon to do COVID testing. And legitimately, there was a lack of resources to be able to cope with the capacity of COVID testing. But I know I was approached by a company who said they wanted to start COVID testing. And I went, great, you need to be regulated, you need to be assessed, you need to have this done before you can start testing. They wanted to open a lab like tomorrow, and they had already ordered their equipment. And I said, I think you need to rewind a little bit here, because you're looking at least a 6-month lead time to be able to get all your regulatory needs met, have your quality management system, have everything functional. And at that point, and looking at the resources you need and the size of what your organization is, I suggest that you probably refer it out to somebody that's already accredited. So it's about being realistic sometimes too, about, and he's like, but I already ordered the equipment. It's going to be here next week. And I'm going, sorry. It's just not something that's reasonable and feasible. And going back to what Tara said as well about the getting things through the health systems. And so I have dealt with a number of new startup laboratories, lab developed tests, and the context that we have this great test and next week Alberta Health Services will cover this test is not reality. I think back to the PSA test when it was developed for prostate diagnostics. And for decades, literally decades, men had to pay for that test. It was not covered by Alberta Healthcare. It is now, but it took decades to get there. So again, being realistically about what your funding models are going to be, certainly being accredited or regulated helps you move that forward. But the reality is it's not a really quick journey. That 100 steps may take a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
No, I would agree. I think maybe as well, just to quickly add to what also Tara said a bit earlier, right? I think one thing is if you take the diagnostics space, of course the accreditation is an important thing, but I think we had as well those kind of experience, probably a lot of those where companies were just approaching us and just saying, look, we have a study, we have evidence. Get me the funding done, ideally as well in those 6 months, right? And then one time, one of the examples or a couple of those examples we had was basically, yeah, the evidence was there, but it was just, let's say, not in the way that payers wanted to have it, right? Either it was not randomized, either there was no comparator, or the comparator was not as the payers basically wanted to have it in that given country, or even worse, right? If it's worse, I don't know. The outcome parameters have not been in the way payers wanted to have it, right? I think diabetes is my favorite example, right? I mean, HbA1c probably every diabetic knows, but that's normally not the key parameter for payers, right? They basically look for the endpoints which really are impactful on the patients, meaning myocardial infarction, strokes, diabetic feet, etc. Right? Those are the drivers, and that is not what, especially maybe clinical scientists then are looking for in the early days. Which is again going back, and that's including regulatory. You first need to know fully agree what type of product you have, and then you should already know early which kind of pathway to take, because then you can take all of that kind of let's say steps out of those hundreds. Maybe you should know already the 90th step, right? That you can do the second step correct, and that's I think where also what Tara said. It might look overwhelming, but ultimately, if you take one step after the other, and if you do it correctly, you can still do it one after the other. You should just know when to know which kind of information, when to also implement it then correctly.
Yeah, and I would add I've definitely seen examples when you're doing that sort of landscape assessment
Yeah.
around the unmet need. That can really help inform and pivot your value messaging. So we saw several examples in terms of subgroups, subpopulations. So, for example, there was a cancer therapy, but it affected fertility. It was more effective. It led to better survival, but it would impact fertility. And so you saw for your population, of course, women of childbearing age would choose to have fertility over survival. Whereas other populations, of course, post childbearing years would be like, well, no, I want survival. That childbearing doesn't actually have any meaning for me. So understanding things like that in terms of your patient population, because there may be sort of key drivers, maybe there's an unmet need for a specific subpopulation within your therapeutic area that's really going to help drive that messaging and that urgency to have your product available to patients. So really doing that landscape assessment, what's currently out there, how are patients currently being treated, and what's not working about that, and really thinking about talking to patients, physicians, caregivers, if it's pediatric or maybe neurodegenerative, is important to really understand what is that need and what does that look like. We're finding that, a little bit of it is talk the talk as opposed to walk the walk, but all the agencies are saying they do care. Even our government's saying, oh, patient outcomes, right? And it's like, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
It doesn't just mean clinical outcomes. It doesn't just mean you live longer. You should be living better. But how do you actually measure that? And how do you show that your innovation has that sort of societal impact? Maybe there's a bigger impact here. And if you can figure out that messaging, your whole value chain then improves again from investors. They're going to feel more interested and compassionate towards what it is the problem you're trying to solve just becomes that much more focused. And then from a messaging perspective, from regulatory right through to payers, it's going to support that. Even if it means you're biting off a smaller piece of your market, that's fine. Get on the market and you can expand your indication after that. But you could really help yourself by understanding where is the greatest unmet need, focus, double down on that, get in, and then collect more evidence to be able to show that we can help even more people than just this.
Yeah, exactly.
The entrepreneur in me really loves that, Tara, because sometimes when we're talking about regulatory pathways and stuff, all we hear is like slow down, caution,
Yeah.
de-risk. But an entrepreneur and a typical founder is like break boundaries, break rules, go fast as possible, make mistakes. So I'm seeing this this conflict. And
Yeah.
so what you were talking about is actually quite a nice balance between
Mhm.
the two two thought processes. It's not about slowing things down. It's actually about speeding things up and having a long-term vision and a realistic approach to reaching that vision so that it's sustainable and scalable.
I agree. It's slow
Yes,
down to speed up. Slow down at the start, and then that will help you speed up. But you
and
have to slow down.
I would say I agree. I'm fairly entrepreneurial, which is not the norm for most regulatory people. And I would say speed up, but make sure you're on the right road. Because if your aim is to get to Red Deer and you're on the highway to Lethbridge, you are not going to get where you want to be.
So true.
Great example. Stefan, did you want to say something?
No, all fine, all fine. I mean, I would agree. I think it's not about slowing down. It's basically really get on the fast pace, especially towards the end. And I think if you do the things right at the beginning, you might be ending up in the right space much faster. I think that's probably more the kind of idea behind.
Love that. Now, we have a couple of audience questions. First is, again, going back locally, what is the evidence requirements in Canada and the US, and how do they differ from other regions?
I can take a quick little stab, and then these guys can sort of chime in. They are kind of interesting. The FDA, right, is where you go certainly for your regulatory approval. If you're talking about the US market versus Health Canada, so you can kind of pick like which is your regulatory agency of choice. One of the distinguishing differences, the FDA is more interested in real world evidence, let's just say, than Health Canada. So when it comes to sort of regulatory and evidence that you're putting forward, obviously the point of regulatory is safety and efficacy. Does it work and is it safe? Can we authorize this for marketing in our country, right? So they're not as much caring about cost effectiveness. That's not really their problem. They're focused on, is it safe and does it work? But the type of evidence that you put forward as an innovator can look different in those two countries. The other thing to keep in mind is jurisdictional evidence. So will the FDA accept Canadian data and vice versa? The answer is usually yes, unless there's a reason to think that it's not applicable. Their preference is always going to be for their own jurisdictional data, though. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then when it comes to the reimbursement pathway, if you're a drug or a device, you'll typically go through Canada's drug agency. The US does not have a health technology assessment agency. So after regulatory approval, you're basically going direct to payers, and it's a very big market, multiple payers, multiple health systems. So that's where it kind of becomes a little bit more messy, and you'd need some strategic input into which systems or payers do you approach and why and how to do that. So you'll want that sort of strategic market access expertise for the US market. Canada makes it a little bit sort of, it's a hoop, so it's easier, but it's not easier in that sense. You're a bit more direct to market in the US. Canada, it's like next. So your next hoop is that cost effectiveness argument. So it's safe and it works great. What is the value for money for the health system? So Canada's drug agency represents the public payers. It basically represents each of the province's public health systems to say, is this cost effective? Is this something we can recommend? You cannot have conversations with the public payers without a positive recommendation from Canada's drug agency. And as I say, they do look at devices. It's sort of complicated, but they do in many instances in order to give those recommendations. And then your next hoop is actually talking to the provincial public payers. So you would literally be talking to Alberta Health to have a conversation to get, if this is a drug or a device that's going to be used in hospital, you be talking directly to them. So it's just hard because it really, again, depends on your innovation. Is it a device? Is it a drug? Is it invasive? Is it direct to consumer? What does that look like? So I would say the pathway in the US, in theory, is faster, but just as complicated, maybe even a little bit more so, but faster. In Canada, it's slower, but as a sort of a Canadian innovator, it may be a little bit of a softer kind of launch, and then you can build up your market access in Canada to then enter the US. So I totally bow to Stefan and Karen's expertise here. I think it's going to be a little bit dependent on your technology and what that pathway looks like, which would be the optimal kind of country to launch in sort of sequentially.
Great. Thank you, Tara. Appreciate that. And we have one other question from Pablo. When working on an idea that might help relieve pressure on the healthcare system, what are some practical evidence-based ways to test and validate whether the product or service is actually viable? Is it more or less difficult than targeting patients and users directly?
Yeah, I mean, if it's more or less difficult, right? That probably depends again, right? I mean, as economists,
Depends.
you say that a lot of times, right? It depends, but ultimately, I think there are ways how to maybe approach and maybe as well get some kind of further feedback onto your kind of idea, or even when it's a bit further, right? I mean, there are of course opportunities either through kind of advisory board meetings with experts from the system. Some systems even have, let's say, regular kind of pathways in order to get consultations directly with systems, and some other kind of, let's say, systems even have, let's say, kind of innovation pathways where you could maybe especially discuss early on if you have a product, for example, which is especially more for the advantage of the system itself. So I think I'm not a UK fully UK expert, but I think Tara, you are probably. But I think UK has, I think, some of those let's say pathways. France has those, Germany has those, and then I think the last part is, of course, as well, there might be even some kind of early kind of access programs as well available for the different kind of products. But again, also here, it depends again. I mean, whether you have a drug, a medical device, etc. So that's probably something keep in mind. In short terms, I think there are ways in order to get ready feedback early on. And I would rather say it's not more complex if you would, let's say, try to figure out a path if you directly target patients.
Thank you very much. So we are coming to the end of the webinar now. I'm going to make an attempt to summarize at the very high level everything that we discussed. So first of all, let's find an unmet need, a problem that we want to solve. Let's face it, we're in the healthcare industry. There are a lot of problems, and we need our expertise to solve them. Let's not just think about what that solution is, but also the innovation of ways, how it's going to get integrated and adopted. Obviously, it's going to require patience and, like what we talked about, unlike minds to get all the way through those 100 steps that it's going to take plus. We should be adopting that global mindset. What kind of value that we can provide in the marketplace, what differentiators we have versus other companies in similar spaces. And start thinking about this stuff earlier rather than later. And what I love most is that there are lots of nerds out there that we can hire. So hire a nerd and find the experts in all of these areas so that we can go as fast as possible. Do any of you have some final thoughts or anything to add to that very brief summary?
I would like to just say I totally agree with the comments that have been made, is start early. Don't wait. And for anybody that wants to meet regulatory or accreditation requirements, start early. Don't buy something off the shelf, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's you've got to do what you say and say what you do. And if you buy something off the shelf, it's likely not going to be a good fit. You might get pants that are way too big or way too tight, and you'll be going back to ground zero to build your own system. So again, start early. Don't wait until the end. Start your planning for everything early. Get your map out and determine which highway you need to be on and where your gas stops are on the way. So again, just reiterating what Tara and Stefan have also said.
Karen, you're the queen of analogies. No one likes tight or loose pants. I really appreciate that.
I'll let Stefan get the last word here, since he's our wonderful international guest. I would just say it's the who, what, where, when, why, how. Like, who do you need to generate information for? Why do you need it? And then, well, what do you need? How are you going to get it? Really just work through a really logical step-by-step approach, because, if you can kind of be upfront with that, it's a lot less costly. Do it all sort of, at that landscape assessment, get a broad look across as many jurisdictions as you think you're going to want to enter, and do that up front. Really understand that there are going to be some differences between regulatory reimbursement, different countries, and then of course the nuances of whether you have a drug, a device, or a digital technology. So thinking about, what do you need to prove to who and by when, and then work backwards to accomplish that.
Yeah, exactly. No, I can only agree with that. And I mean, since we are in Canada, I would maybe just say, don't be the Toronto Maple Leafs, right? They're good in the, let's say, in the regular season, but ultimately what you want to achieve is basically get the cup at the end, right? So I think the Florida Panthers, I think, have been a very good example. They basically backed up early on, meaning planning ahead of time, right? Which players to get in there, which kind of tactics you should as well evolve over time in order to then win the cup. And that's the same thing, right? If you want to be successful ultimately at the end, you need to be starting early enough, put everything to the right place, speak, and also get, I think, as you, Crystal, said it, get the right nerds on board, and then you're successful. But if you just rush that towards the end, you will not be successful. Do it stepwise, think about those 100 steps, and then you will also be fast at the very end. That's probably more my kind of advice as well, as a kind of sum up of what we discussed.
Appreciate it. Well, thanks again, everybody. Hope you enjoy the rest of your Friday and weekend ahead.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night.
Bye.